Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. And this is Webster Tarpley coming to you from Washington, D.C. Here we are on the afternoon of October 14th, 2016, culminating a tumultuous week. And today it's in itself a tumultuous day. Today is the day that the Trump campaign is supposed to submit their incontrovertible evidence showing that the various accusations against their candidates on the part of women who say that they were molested, that those charges, according to the campaign, are going to be refuted. So we will be looking for that. And of course, that's a tall order. I think right now, I'm not sure of the count, but I think we're between 7 and 9 women who have come forward with very serious accusations of the sexual assault, in effect. Right? This is now the general media consensus that that's what this represents. So the proof from the Trump people supposedly today. I would also stress that we need to keep our eyes on the White House and the National Security Council in particular to check up on a meeting between Obama and his top aides, effectively the National Security Council, with the Secretary of State, with the Pentagon Chief Ashton Carter, with Brennan of the CIA, and all the other statutory members, including Susan Rice, the director of the National Security Council. So this is an NSC meeting, and the question is what to do about Syria. And let us devote our first segment to this. The answer to what to do about Syria is, above all, what not to do. No direct U.S. military action against the Syrian government of President Bashar al-Assad, and no clashes with the military forces of the Russian Federation now operating in Syria. These are the two cardinal points, the two stars that we have to guide ourselves by. No military escalation. And of course, it means no bombing of Assad. It means no hostilities with Russia, actions of incalculable, inconceivable folly on the part of irresponsible officials. As a matter of fact, I would recommend to Obama, any official who recommends military action likely to embroil the United States in conflict with the Russian Federation should be fired on the spot, out, canned. Leave the room, escorted out by security, right? By the Secret Service, by the Marines, whoever you have. Get them out. Such voices are not needed. And that would also mean that Secretary of State John Kerry ought to keep his mouth shut. He has been taped this past week talking to or a week or two ago, talking to some Syrian activists at the Dutch or Netherlands mission to the United Nations, and he keeps saying that he has argued military action and he has lost the argument, and that it's a small minority by now. Kerry, I don't know whether Ashton Carter does it quite that way, but I think he might be part of the pro-escalation coalition. And Samantha Power, of course, loopy old Samantha Power, who is held in low regard by the professional military because of her utopian doctrines, which go really beyond anybody else in view. Now, the method used by President Obama up to now is eminently sound. It is the one reassuring factor in this madhouse of a world, and that would be Obama's demand that anybody proposing that kind of military escalation, either U.S. troops in any numbers on the ground in Syria, or, God forbid, direct attacks on the Syrian Air Force, Syrian air defenses. They now have the S-200s. That's not as easy as it might sound anymore. But Obama's criterion has been, prove to me that you will improve the situation with this, because we've just had this, again, cynical, absolutely cynical campaign of sympathy, tugging at the heartstrings of the American people and Western Europe and many around the world on this humanitarian issue of what can you do about Aleppo. And, of course, the situation in Aleppo is of grave concern to someone like me and many others. But that's not enough. It's not enough to say, well, there's this crying need to do something. You've got to prove apodictically, in other words, irrefutably, prove that it's going to make it better. The situation has to get better. This is a good rule to bear in mind. The Arab Spring, a lot of people who supported the Arab Spring said, well, look, those are dictatorships. Yeah, but you've got to prove that there's a solution waiting in the wings that will actually make things better, because otherwise the bad situation of today becomes the pretext for a much worse situation tomorrow. Now, we have gleaned from various press coverage that it is extremely unlikely that President Obama would be guilty of such utter folly as to escalate the conflict in Syria. I think bomb Assad, that's a loser from the beginning. Bomb Russia, it's even worse. It's even more inconceivable. It's absolutely insane. There is, however, this no-fly zone or safe zone. Obama knows exactly what that is, but unfortunately, the American people don't. And let us point out, the no-fly zone or safe zone ceased to be a real option 13 months ago, in September of 2015, when the Russian Air Force and other Russian forces arrived in Syria. That was the end of the no-fly zone. The people who wanted it had a specious case before that, but after that they have absolutely no case at all, because then you're going to be clashing with these Russian planes. And if you're bombing a Syrian airfield, you're going to get shot down by S-300s and S-400s and the other highly capable Russian surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, and so forth. So this is no option. This is a dead duck. This is a ticket to World War III. Who in his right mind would do this? And for what? Of course, the problem for the United States is, well, there are many, but one of them is certainly the idea that the U.S., instead of doing the obvious thing and backing the relatively stable and internationally recognized government of President Assad, right, a UN member state, an Arab League member state at that point. Kerry himself knew all this because he'd been involved in a back channel to Bashar al-Assad and his wife. The U.S. has chosen, instead of backing that government, right, which has never ceased to function over most of the population of the country, instead of that, we had to stick ourselves with 300 to 350 groups of psychotic jihadi crazies, right? Terrorists, killers, butchers, calling themselves al-Nusra, that's a euphemism for al-Qaeda, and the rest of them, right? The Free Syrian Army being the biggest joke of them all. So the U.S. has been stuck with clients that are absolutely worthless. Time to cut our losses. These people are albatrosses around our neck. Dump them. And somebody should come forward and say that this evening at the NSC. Welcome to the second segment here on World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., the afternoon of October 14th, 2016. We want to remind you that you can now get commentary, analysis, news, historical background, philosophical background from yours truly, and that takes place every day, Monday through Thursday, at americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv. And there, for a token fee, you can subscribe to this. You can subscribe as a normal subscriber, or you can become a kind of distinguished sustainer, someone who's actually supporting the activism which is associated with this project that we have going. So americansystem.tv, and the American system, of course, that's Alexander Hamilton, Henry Clay. That is the touchstone for rational economics, not the Austrian school, not Marx, not Keynes, not the British classics, not the neoliberals, but that winning tradition, right? The tradition that has actually succeeded, going once again from Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton, especially Henry Clay, Lincoln, Justin Morrill, the populists, into the New Deal, into the Kennedy administration, and then into the economic program of the tax Wall Street party. So we are looking at Syria, and we are waiting, we are observing the activity around the White House as Obama gets ready to meet with his principal aides about this question of what to do in Syria. Now, what's going on in Syria right now is what I think is, in some ways, despite the appearances, this is actually the most humane approach, which is to end the civil war. If you can end the Syrian civil war, that will obviously have immediate benefits and dividends on the ground, but at the same time, it would then at least open up the option for people who had been driven to emigrate at great risk to themselves, to attempt to join the stream of refugees going into Europe. It would be a chance to go home and to put an end to, at least to some extent, to moderate, to mitigate the refugee crisis going on in Western Europe. Or indeed in all of Europe, Eastern Europe also. And what is that? It is that the Russian air forces and the Syrian land and air and indeed sea forces are attempting to liberate the city of Aleppo from the terrorist jihadis, the terrorist rebels that have been tormenting this city for the best part of 5 years. And the world would have to welcome the quelling of those 350 useless and destructive groups that unfortunately have somehow come to represent an illusion in the mind of the American public. So Aleppo can fall, can be liberated, really. Aleppo can be liberated, and it should be liberated. It should be liberated forthwith. And what other option is there? You're going to leave people under the control of 350 groups of madmen who are preaching some apocalyptic doctrine and taking that out of the hide of people with atrocities that are they're as bad as anything anybody does. There's only one side that can promise to bring an end to the bloodletting. The 350 groups will never bring an end to a bloodletting, because if they have no outside opposition, they'll fight among themselves. They are the essence of anarchy and the destruction of civilization. But the Syrian government plus Russia, this is a serious proposition. The United States should support that side. And whatever links, whatever ties have grown up with these 350 obscene groups, those have to be dumped. So David Sanger of the New York Times on NPR this morning laments that the U.S. has no leverage. Yeah, that's because you didn't support the existing government. France wants a war crimes investigation. The French should investigate themselves, because they're also implicated in supporting quite a few of those groups. We're told that Russia is isolated. This is absolutely ridiculous. 13 months of Russian presence in Syria have actually made the situation better. There is no immediate threat to overthrow Assad, but there is an immediate potential, a hope, that Aleppo could be liberated. So I think that's the height of realism. And again, the only mercy of war, the only thing that can make war something a little bit less horrible than it is to end it, bring it to a quick end. Now, therefore, the Russo-Syrian forces should take Aleppo, it's clear, and the other group of forces, the ones backed more directly by the U.S., the Kurds, the YPG Kurds, the Peshmerga Kurds, and some Arab groups there, they need to take over Raqqa and Mosul. We've had Erdogan of Turkey, as usual, causing conflict and confusion by demanding to have Turkey be a part of the liberation of Raqqa and, Mosul in particular. Now, this is mighty strange. With the army they have, the Turkish government could have gone in and rolled over Mosul any point in the last 4 to 5 years. Right? The Turkish army is by far the largest in this region. So Erdogan, it never occurred to him to do that until somebody else was doing it, and then he wanted to have a part of it. So I think he's been rebuffed because the other participants in this coalition profoundly mistrust the aggrandizement, right? The demand of Erdogan for more territory and territorial expansion. They don't want any part of him. So the Turks now say that they will go in solo on their own from their own side of this stuff. This is obviously not positive. So the other thing we want to say is no advanced weapons should be given to these jihadis. None. No man pads, no shoulder-held portable surface-to-air missiles, no Stingers, none of this stuff. They don't deserve any of it, because if you give it to them, they'll sell it, and it will then be found deployed in Europe or in the United States or in Japan or someplace else, which was not what you bargained with. So we have to learn the lesson of Afghanistan already, which is that these jihadi groups, including those that really are Al-Qaeda, they call themselves Al-Qaeda, none of them are trustworthy. Dump them. Get rid of them. Don't let them drag the U.S. into World War III. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Back to World Crisis Radio. And it's, again, October 14th, 2016. You're invited cordially to go to AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv, and pick up on The American System. I'm sorry, we're doing World Crisis Radio now, and we're inviting you to subscribe to the American System. So please go and do that. Then you can keep up every day of the week. Now, in the context of this Syria stuff, right, where we're demanding that Obama come out and repudiate military escalation. So it means no advanced weapons for terrorist jihadis, of course. And it means no military conflict with Syria. It means no military conflict with Russia. Indeed, tomorrow we have the meeting of Secretary of State Kerry with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Lausanne, Switzerland. That's actually a positive sign, because Kerry, foolishly, in a fit of pique, I don't know what, had said that the diplomatic contacts between the United States and Russia were at an end. Well, that's just silly. They have to go on. There is no alternative to peacemaking and negotiations, right? Unless you're a complete fool. I would urge people, look at that wonderful example of Richelieu, the great cardinal who built modern France. And he said, you got to negotiate with everybody all the time, and you'll always benefit. They may benefit, but you will benefit for sure. We did have that nasty British House of Commons debate earlier this week, right? Called by an ally of General Petraeus to try to gin up some action on the warmonger front. And there we have Boris Johnson a irresponsible person, really, an immature leader, right? Obviously, psychologically not suited for this job. And of course, he was a great backer of the Brexit, which has now turned to dust and ashes, with the pound crashing every day of the week, right? If you were in Britain and you had any savings in pounds, you're now out of luck because it's down to about $1.20. We may be headed for pound-dollar parity once again. Parity, 1-to-1. That would be very bad for British savers. So Boris Johnson was shooting his mouth off to the effect that he wanted to see demonstrations at the Russian embassy in London. That's awful. I mean, that's just irresponsible. That is below the dignity of any foreign minister, right? A country with which you have diplomatic relations, again, United Nations member state, permanent member of the UN Security Council, and you want to get some street action against them going. It's just awful. The voice of reason turned out to be Emily Thornberry, the shadow foreign secretary of the Labour Party, who said the main question is to get the armed jihadis out of Aleppo. And in saying this, she is in full accord with Staffan de Mistura, the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria, who said that he would be glad to go and himself lead, escort, accompany those jihadis out of Aleppo. And the classic quote called up by Emily Thornberry, jaw is better than war. It's a whole lot better. So these people in the U.S. Government should realize that. But we have all kinds of crazy people who are doing moral posturing, and essentially at the expense of the United States. In other words, there are all kinds of people all over the world who want to take a strong moral stand on various issues. And when they do this, whether they know it or not, they are essentially, the idea is that the U.S. GI, the U.S. population are going to be shouldering this burden. For example, Jonathan Friedland, Freedland, in the London Guardian, who says, "Oh, this is the kind of facile stuff that I think is really irresponsible. If they really wanted to stop the war in Syria, they'd target Russia," says Friedland. "If the United States were bombing Aleppo, peace protesters would be besieging its embassy, so why let Vladimir Putin off the hook?" Now, this is not attacking the U.S. directly, but the idea is get something going where the U.S. might be forced to do something. And of course, this Jonathan Friedland, he's acting out the program of Boris Johnson, the Tory, the foreign secretary currently, in the Theresa May cabinet. God, saints preserve us. Now, something interesting here in the U.S., the Boston Globe, and this is most welcome. This is a guy called Stephen Kinzer, and the article is not really that recent, but February 18th, 2016, and it is as applicable today as it ever has been. And it goes like this. The title, we'll give as much as we can in this segment. "The media are misleading the public on Syria." Boston Globe, February 18th, 2016, Stephen Kinzer. "Coverage of the Syrian war will be remembered as one of the most shameful episodes in the history of the American press. Reporting about carnage in the ancient city of Aleppo is the latest reason why. For 3 years, it's now almost 4 years, violent militants have run Aleppo. Their rule began with a wave of repression. They posted notices warning residents, 'Don't send your children to school. If you do, we will take their backpacks and you will get them back in a coffin.' Then they destroyed factories, hoping that unemployed workers would have no recourse other than to become fighters. They trucked looted machinery to Turkey and sold it there. So demontage of the existing industry, meager though that might have been. This month, and this was, again, back in February, but this is the story of 2016. People in Aleppo have finally seen glimmers of hope. The Syrian army and its allies have been pushing militants out of the city. Last week, they reclaimed the main power plant. Regular electricity may soon be restored. The militants' hold on the city could be ending. The militants, true to form, the terrorists, are wreaking havoc as they're pushed out of the city by Russian and Syrian military forces. And one Aleppo resident writes on social media, Turkish Saudi-backed moderate rebels are showering the residential neighborhoods of Aleppo, this means on the government side, with unguided rockets and gas jars. I guess it's a kind of gas bomb. Notice, we hear about barrel bombs, but we don't hear about the typical weapons of these jihadis. The Beirut-based analyst Marwa Osma asked, the Syrian Arab army, which is led by President Assad, is the only force on the ground, along with their allies, who are fighting ISIS. So you want to weaken the only system that is fighting ISIS? Now, maybe that's somewhat changed. We certainly hope so, right, that the U.S. and those Kurds have been doing a lot. I don't think what she wrote was accurate. But certainly the Assad people are fighting ISIS and these others, and the Al-Qaeda. This does not fit with Washington's narrative. As a result, much of the American press is reporting the opposite of what is actually happening. Many news reports suggest that Aleppo has become a liberated zone, but for 3 years, and now is being pulled back into misery. Americans are being told that the virtuous course in Syria is to fight the Assad regime and its Russian and Iranian partners. We're supposed to hope that a righteous coalition of Americans, Turks, Saudis, and Kurds with moderate opposition will win. This is convoluted nonsense. We'll be back in a minute here on World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley once again reporting from Washington, D.C., and we're recommending that you keep up with our analysis, background, history, philosophy, other important insights, 4 more days a week than we can do with this program. And that means go to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv, and for a token fee, you can get this every day of the week. We just want to finish this really unusual, and I was digging it up from a couple of months ago, but beginning of the year. The media are misleading the public on Syria by Stephen Kinzer, Kinzer. And this addresses today, it collides with this obvious public relations campaign. I think it's called the Syria campaign or the Syrian campaign or the campaign for Syria, which is a kind of Kuwait incubator babies, Jessica Lynch operation designed to generate a public hysteria and try to provoke a wider war, because that's what some of these people want. And where they get their money, gee, I don't know. Saudi Arabia might be interested. Turkey might be interested. Any of the Gulf monarchies, right? The ones, we had this funny thing where one of these really low-level, uninteresting WikiLeaks things. This has generally been a big yawn, but they have this thing in there where Hillary talks about the fact that Saudis and I think 1 or 2 other Gulf monarchies that she has, they're supporting ISIS, she says. And then the libertarians turn around and try to say that's her fault. She's telling the Saudis to do this. No, I don't see how that follows. But you also got to remember that at the time, Joe Biden, and this was just a couple of days after that document, that speech or whatever it was generated, that in early October 2014, Joe Biden at the Kennedy School of Government in Harvard Square, Massachusetts, came out and said, look, our biggest problem in the Middle East is our allies. We have the Saudis, we have Qatar, we have United Arab Emirates and Turkey, and they're all supporting ISIS. So that's supposed to be news. Remember, one of the hallmarks of the limited hangout is that nothing new emerges, right? Ellsberg, that stuff was all known to readers of Le Monde or Corriere della Sera. Everybody knew it. In the case of Assange, the stuff that got him his creds to begin with was a massacre, very serious atrocity by the U.S., but well known, although no photographs. So what he added was the photographs. And then with Snowden, it's simply a bunch of NSA programs where the fact of their existence and some details had been published by the New York Times on the front page. What Snowden added was, generally speaking, a few code names. But let's go back to this article on Syria, right? Because we've just heard how what nonsense the official line is, right? How absurd it is, right? You want to bomb Assad and give the entire country either to the 350 groups or the Nusra Brigade and or ISIS. This is absolutely suicidal folly. Why is it? Kinzer has an explanation. Under intense financial pressure, American newspapers have reduced their foreign news gathering. A lot of this now comes from people based in Washington. And in order to do that, you've got to check with the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House, and think tanks. And, well, they become stenographers for those institutions. And we get into this group think. Much less actual news gathering in the field. That's I feel lucky that I've been to Syria approximately 5 years ago now. We're told that Nusra is rebels or moderates. Well, of course, they're the Al Qaeda people, even if they change their name. Turkey has for years been running a rat line for foreign fighters wanting to join terrorist groups in Syria. But because the United States wants to stay on Turkey's good side, we hear little about it. And we're not, we're sometimes given articles about how good the Kurds, the YPG Kurds are, but got to remember, Turkey is trying to kill them. Two, everything Russia and Iran do in Syria is described as negative and destabilizing, not because it really is, but because getting after those countries is the official line. So, conclusion, Americans are said to be ignorant of the world. And he concedes that this is unfortunately so. Other people are also ignorant, but if people in Bhutan or Bolivia misunderstand Syria, this has a limited effect. But ignorance of foreign affairs on the part of the U.S. population is very dangerous, because if you act on it, then that's going to be disastrous. In other words, you can't act on that kind of stuff. So the entire perspective that's being generated here is utterly bankrupt. We want to remind everybody that this stuff from Assange and WikiLeaks, this is again a big yawn. This is essentially of extremely limited interest, and therefore we ought to think about WikiLeaks for a minute, though. You can go to tarpley.net and you can find the what did I have, 6 or 7 or 8 hallmarks, ways that you can tell a limited hangout. Those, I think, are worth reviewing, and maybe we'll do that during this coming week on the American system. But the idea is, how can serious news organizations take seriously material coming from WikiLeaks? When you think about it, we're told on NPR this morning that a lot of these newsrooms are focused on what is Assange dishing up today. Did he do 2,000, 3,000? Does he have 50,000? And we have yet to see anything really that newsworthy, right? We've discovered this nefarious fact that the Hillary Clinton campaign is trying to get Hillary Clinton elected president. Can you believe it? Outrageous. So a lot of this is just it's a kind of prurient desire to hear people talk when they think they're not being overheard, but then of course they are going to be overheard. But WikiLeaks, right? So this is a fly-by-night organization. It clearly doctors, it clearly massages, it clearly prepares the stuff that it puts out. It may alter the things that it puts out. And we have so-called serious news organizations who now orient their day around this. And I think it's a kind of intellectual and moral bankruptcy. So if you want to understand, let me see if I can just give you the summary of these things. The ways that you can do such a trigger are, well, that the guy who's doing it undergoes a Damascus Road conversion. In other words, you go from being something else to what you are, right? Ellsberg was a nuclear planner, then became a peace angel. That other people who have bigger secrets are systematically ignored. That the content of what is so-called revealed is actually already known, but perhaps seeded with a few interesting tidbits, again, some code names and things that are not known to make the whole thing look newer and more exciting. And perhaps the most important, it is a way to say something good about somebody very often by pretending to say something bad. In other words, to focus on trivial aspects of a public figure without getting to their real crimes and their real abuses. So take a look at it. You can find it on tarpley.net. And again, it's called How to Identify a CIA Limited Hangout Operation. Sources going back to the early 1600s. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome to the second hour of World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C. Now, spent the first hour on Syria. We should also point out all of this involves negotiation with Russia. It is imperative that the Kerry-Lavrov talks, now scheduled for Saturday, the 15th of October, the Ides of October, in Lausanne, Switzerland. Those have to succeed. We've got to do everything to make them succeed. I urge Obama to give the proper instructions to Kerry. And Kerry should not repeat that unfortunate episode where he says, well, Obama has his policy and I have mine. That's unacceptable. Ministerial responsibility makes such kind of behavior out of the question. But now we have to get back to the domestic side. So here we are now in a presidential campaign, and instead of the clash of ideas, programs, and perspectives, we have a situation of mutual accusations. Our point of view here is that anybody who wants to win an election and win it in a convincing way, win it for sure, but win it in a convincing way, you need to keep the stress on mass traction economic demands. Those need to be class-based mass traction economic demands. They need to be anti-austerity class-based mass traction economic demands. And you can see the calculation of the Clinton campaign that they wish now to concentrate exclusively on the personality of the Republican candidate and his alleged actions in the past. I can understand this. And indeed, those actions raise very, very serious issues. But still, the future of a country has to be based on something somewhat different. It has to be based on an economic program. If Mrs. Clinton wants to win the Millennials, she needs to come forward with a very specific plan for refinancing the existing $1.3 trillion of high-interest student debt. Get that interest down to zero as a minimum thing you can do. 0% interest and maturities of 50 years or more, whatever it takes. And then who pays? Should it be the taxpayers? Should it be working people? Should it come out of the Social Security Trust Fund? Should it be borrowed from China? None of those. It should come from a tax on Wall Street transactions, which she also has in her program, but that's got to be specified as a 1% Wall Street sales tax with the idea that it's going to be split between the feds and the states, and that it's going to be applied to derivatives as well as the obvious stocks, bonds, and other kinds of securities. So that's what you ought to be doing. The 10% ceiling on the child care expenses for working families. That's a great idea. And on the education point, you've got to talk about how debt-free college and or free college will work, right? Free college up to $125,000 family income, federal adjusted gross income, I guess. And then beyond that, debt-free college for people with slightly more income. The goal has to be that every American teenager completes high school and goes to college, because only in this way can we succeed, can we hope to compete in the world of the 21st century. So all of those other things, we'll go through reviews. We've done issue reviews, especially on the daily program, that is to say the American System Network. But you can see the idea. Because if you don't do that, you're not going to get the millennials in the sufficient numbers, and you're not going to build a consensus so you actually have a mandate. And I think that's important. So opportunism may be attractive. Jump on this stuff because it's breaking out all over the place, of course, and you'd be crazy not to. But don't do this to such an extent that the actual issues are crowded out. You can see that the Republican candidate is doing that, right? He built his house on the anti-free trade. I won't say protectionism, because he never got into real protectionism. He never advocated a protective tariff, but anti-free trade, I guess we could say, at least at a verbal level. And then also the wall built by Mexico, and the question of the ban on Muslims coming into the United States. He doesn't talk about that stuff anymore. He has now decided to devote everything to feuding. Some say that the strategy of the Republican Party is now to try to suppress voter turnout. Sometimes they try to do it with things like voter ID. We're told the Republican candidate has announced his intention to build up a poll watchers corps. I'm afraid that there's a grave danger that any poll watchers corps with that kind of mentality will become a vehicle for attempting to intimidate and harass voters, which is illegal. And you're not allowed to deprive anybody of their civil rights, right? That can be grounds then for action in the federal courts. So it is a mistake. Anybody who does not advance mass traction economic demands, or something that might look like, in the case of the Republicans, something that somebody might be fooled into thinking was a mass traction economic demand, you'll pay a price. Now, in terms of our current situation, right? Last week, after this program was concluded, we had the Access Hollywood tape, and with the Access Hollywood tape, we then had an outpouring of criticism, condemnation, revulsion, which is undoubtedly sincere and which continues now, right, through the speech by Michelle Obama yesterday, by President Obama, and by others. We've also had then, during the past weekend, a bunch of Republican defections. I think 16 or 17 senators, 5 governors, a couple of dozen congresspeople. What we then saw was that after the debate last Sunday evening, given the bizarre behavior of the Republican contender, but given a strange interpretation put on that by the media, there has been a kind of a pendulum effect. In other words, I see some of these Republicans, people in the condition of Kelly Ayotte or some of the others, right? They seem to go back and forth, right? They were doing that for quite a while, and then they said, well, we want to have the current Republican nominee drop out, okay? But then they forget about that for a while. So you have a kind of a pendulum or a shuttle effect, right? The shuttle on the loom, or the shuttle between Times Square and Grand Central, right? So it just goes back and forth. Some of them are going to be going back and forth all the way to Election Day, I suspect. Then, during the course of the week, and starting especially yesterday evening and the night before, the New York Times came forward with two women who were offering concrete allegations against the Republican nominee. We had People magazine with an allegation from a woman against the Republican nominee. The Palm Beach paper won yesterday, and there may have been more. There was a group of young women who had been contestants in Miss Universe, Miss USA, Miss Teen USA, I guess, one or the other of those, and they had complained that their dressing rooms had been invaded by the owner of the pageants, who is now, of course, the Republican nominee. So, and then we've got two this afternoon. I'll get to those in just a minute here on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So we're dealing with the current phase of the U.S. election campaign, which is a series of accusations by women who are now coming forward and speaking publicly about what they were subjected to by the current Republican nominee. And we already had quite a number of these. And then today, Friday, we've had Karen Tumulty of the Washington Post earlier in the afternoon interviewing a lady by the name of Kristen Anderson, who recounts a shocking incident that happened to her at the China Club in New York City early in the 1990s. And we've also got the well-known attorney in Los Angeles, I think, Gloria Allred. And Gloria Allred is introducing another lady by the name of Summer Zervos in her press conference in the middle of the afternoon here in the East on Friday. So she also says that she was mistreated by Trump. Now, the Trump campaign denies all of this. They deny everything. Indeed, the Trump campaign has been so emphatic that they actually promised for today proof, and that would have to be ironclad, right, watertight proof that none of this happened. Now, again, that's epistemologically that's very difficult to do, but we're all ears. We're still paying attention. As far as we know, such proof has not been offered. So we are left with this continuous process of allegations being made. Now, in the middle of this, though, I think one thing to pay special attention is that the lawyers for Trump have threatened to sue the New York Times because of what was published. And especially given one's own circumstances, this is obviously a very, very disturbing tendency, right? That instead of having a presidential campaign based on the clash of ideas, we seem to have one where the role of threatened lawsuits or actual lawsuits looms larger and larger. So I think in the middle of this, we have the letter written by the lawyers for the New York Times, Kasowitz, Benson, Torres, and Friedman, LLP, 1633 Broadway. and they're responding to a demand for a retraction coming from, I'm sorry, this is the Kasowitz is the lawyer for Trump. So cancel everything I said. Kasowitz, Benson, Torres, and Friedman LLP. That's the lawyer for Mr. Trump. So this article, this letter actually is coming from David E. McCraw, representing the New York Times. So McCraw writes, in response to your letter of October 12th to Dean Beckett, the editor of the New York Times, concerning your client Donald Trump, Republican Party nominee for President of the United States, you write concerning our article, 2 women say Donald Trump touched them inappropriately and labeled the article as libel per se. You ask us that we remove it from our website, issue a full and immediate retraction and apology. We decline to do so. Now, here's I think the point. The essence of a libel claim, of course, is the protection of one's reputation. Mr. Trump has bragged about his non-consensual touching of women. He has bragged about intruding on beauty pageant contestants and so forth in their rooms, and a series of other things. Multiple women have come forward publicly to report on these unwanted advances. Nothing in our article has the slightest effect on the reputation that Mr. Trump, through his own words and actions, has already created for himself. So the New York Times claims due diligence and says that they would welcome the opportunity to test the matter in court. If Mr. Trump disagrees, if he believes that American citizens had no right to hear what these women had to say, and that the law of this country forces us and those who would dare to criticize him to stand silent or be punished, we welcome the opportunity to have a court set him straight. So again, that's the New York Times lawyer David E. McCraw writing to the law firm representing the Republican presidential candidate. So that, I think, that points to, I think, a very interesting situation. We've also got, let's see, the Washington Post commenting on this matter, right, since they're looking at the New York Times. Libel suit against the New York Times would be hard to win. Trump's threat may have more to do with intimidation than the law. And this involves these 2 ladies that were interviewed, right? And this they've now appeared on CNN and many more. And here we read what we've been talking about here in recent months. As a practical matter, Trump's chances of prevailing in such a suit are low, writes the Washington Post. As a public figure, he would have to satisfy 2 principles embedded in libel law. Did the Times publish its statements knowing that the women's statements were false and that they were published with actual malice, reckless disregard of whether they were true or not, true or false? The standard comes from a landmark Supreme Court ruling in 1964 involving the New York Times. In the ruling in that case, New York Times versus Sullivan, made it difficult for public figures to win libel cases because it requires them to prove the defendant's prior knowledge and intentions. The court's intent then was to give the news media wide latitude in reporting on public politicians and other public figures. And here we have then a quote from Samantha Barbas, professor at the University of Buffalo Law School specializing in the First Amendment. Quote, actual malice is a very high bar, and I don't imagine that Trump could possibly clear it. Quote, he would have to show that the Times did not research or check their facts at all, or actually knew that the story was false and published it anyway. So that's also the New York Times argument. So we'll be back in just a minute here on World Crisis Radio. Continuing now with this article here in the Washington Post, right? This is from Friday, October 14th by Paul Farhi, F-A-R-H-I, and Robert Barnes. We've heard a couple of things from it. They here, of course, also quote the article from New York Times attorney David E. McCraw. And then we have another expert, Sonia R. West, a First Amendment expert and law professor at the University of Georgia, said that the Republican candidate would have a problem proving he was defamed, even if he could show that the Times stories were false, because he would have to prove that the stories harmed his reputation. Quote, considering all the other shocking news about him lately, much of it concerning his treatment of women, it's hard to imagine that the Times story significantly changed very many people's opinion of him. And of course, they review the fact that the Republican candidate in the course of his campaign has often said he wanted to make the libel laws easier for famous people to open them up, to loosen them up, to weaken the First Amendment, in effect, and that he would support that. So we have a law professor, Ronald K.L. Collins. So Professor Ronald Collins, law professor at the University of Washington, said this would be very hard to do because it would take a law passed by Congress and then a review by the Supreme Court, because it would bear directly on the question of the First Amendment. So, all highly interesting. Now let's look a bit at the campaigns. The first thing I think that we ought to pay attention to is a growing awareness that the Republican Party is collapsing, that it is a shambles, that we now have a faction of people in it of all kinds who want to hang on to Trump. We also have a very significant and growing faction of people who don't want to be associated with Trump by any manner of means. There's also the split between the base and the donor class, and all kinds of other splits that are coming up. Let's take it from the top, right? Article here in the Washington Post of today, Friday, October 14th, Washington Forum. This is Fareed Zakaria, or Zakaria, often appears on CNN, right? CNN on Sunday. So his headline is, the GOP is history. The Republican Party is history. What about the United States? The Republican Party, as we knew it, is dying. The death of a party is not so unusual. Scholars divide U.S. history according to 6 distinct party systems, each responding or corresponding, I think he means to say, to a particular political era. Sometimes parties retain their names but morph ideologically, like the Democratic Party, which went from being the Southern pro-slavery Jim Crow Party up until the 50s and 60s, I guess, in some ways, but then turned into the opposite. I don't know opposite, but certainly changed profoundly. On other occasions, parties collapse entirely, as did the Whig Party in the mid-19th century, torn apart by the divisions over slavery. In fact, he adds, is an interesting parallel. The fall of the Whigs was hastened by the rise of the party known as the Know-Nothings, the American Party, I would say, dedicated to stopping what was then seen as uncontrolled immigration. Of course, in those days, it was from Catholic Europe, right? Irish or Catholic Germans and so forth. Whatever the form of the Republican Party's collapse, it will be messy. Now, the paragraph I've just read it reminds me of many of the things that I've been saying for the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, except right now there have been 6 party systems, but the 6th was the Republican Southern strategy, which took us from 1968, Nixon and Strom Thurmond in Miami, all the way to 2008, when the coming of Obama signaled a new alignment of forces in the electoral college. Again, looking beyond the details, the personalities of this particular race, right, and then looking at what, how the playing field might be changed. Zachariah thinks that Donald Trump is here to stay. Many Republicans have nurtured a fantasy that their party has been briefly taken over by a strange historical aberration who will lose the election and then somehow things will go back to normal. The Republican candidate has now made it clear that he will not go so gently into the night. There will be a fight for what's left of the Republican Party. There will be Ryan involved, a serious conservative. Remember, Ryan is an exponent of the most extreme austerity, of the most savage and draconian cutting of the federal budget, the shredding of the social safety net, the privatization of many of the institutions that the American people need to survive, right? Starting with Social Security, Medicare, and indeed the Postal Service, right? Whether it's Ryan or somebody else in his caucus is a matter of indifference. Mike Pence will try to keep everybody in a big tent, but the word here comes from political scientist Justin Guest, or Jest, G-E-S-T, saying that white Americans in his polling were asked, would you support a policy of stopping mass immigration, providing American jobs to American workers, preserving America's Christian heritage, and stopping the threat of Islam? And he claims that 2/3 of his respondents, that is white Americans, would go along with that. Now, notice that is separate from any concrete individual who would be the bearer of that. And I think once you had a concrete individual promising that kind of a program, you would find that it would change very, very rapidly. So here's the perspective from Fareed. Trump will lose the election. Forget about his polls of last week or the last weeks. He's never been ahead of Hillary Clinton for a single since the two of them were nominated. The major models predicting the election have only once or twice put his chances above 40%. But Trump will not sit in loyal opposition to Clinton, or perhaps anybody. He tells his legions that the election is rigged. He says that the media are lying and that reporting cannot be believed. He warns that the country will be utterly destroyed if Clinton wins, and he is fueling a toxic movement of protest and insurgency. So the Republicans will lose, right, Zachariah, and this destroy the Republican Party. And the frightening question is, what will happen with the country in this process? Now, again, why be pessimistic? Right? Are we so tied to the existence of the Republican Party? Do we really think it's essential? Is it metaphysically necessary? Like, in some schemes, evil is metaphysically necessary. Not mine, but others, because otherwise nothing would happen, right? Some schemes say, well, evil has to fight good, and that's what moves the world along. No, evil is not necessary, not metaphysically necessary. It's there, unfortunately, but it's not necessary. It doesn't have to be there. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. We've come to our last segment here on the 14th of October, 2016. Remember the American System, the American System Network. Every day, go to americansystem.tv and become a part of this daily, Monday through Thursday, information exchange. So we just heard from Fareed Zakaria, Michael Gerson of the Washington Post, this former Bush White House guy, but with Christian overtones, also sees the immediate future for people like him rebuilding from the ruins of the GOP. I say we don't need such a party, right? It is too too crazy, right? Too anarchoid, too much devoted to shutting down the government, bankrupting the government, stripping people of their economic rights. This is not needed. It is the problem. And we should stress it, this week, one of the days the stock market was down, the people on CNBC mentioned one of the causes of stock market sell-off was that Wall Street sees the prospect of a Democratic wave, a Democratic landslide led by Mrs. Clinton, which will end to gridlock. And they went on to say that gridlock is what Wall Street likes best. The financier outlooks think that gridlock is great because it means they're not going to be regulated, they're not going to be taxed or otherwise interfered with, so they can run wild as long as the government is paralyzed. That ought to open somebody's eyes out there. So the prospect would be Democratic president, Democratic House, Democratic Senate, eventually a Democratic Supreme Court, sooner rather than later, and you then have an end to gridlock. You could actually begin to enact some policies. Fix Obamacare, right? Do the little fix. Raise the cap on Social Security. There's a list of a dozen or 2 dozen simple things you could do to essentially restabilize this entire ship of state that we have. So Jerson writes that what we see on the GOP side is the triumph of authoritarian impulses. And here he quotes the madcap Maine governor, Paul LePage. The Constitution is broken, says Paul LePage. Watch out for anybody who says that. The answer to that is Wall Street is broken. LePage says, we need a Trump to show some authoritarian power in our country. Well, that is not going to be attractive rhetoric. Now, let's look at some of the many symptoms of crisis of the Republicans. One, Washington Post, once again of today, Friday the 14th. Ex-nuclear launch officers pen letter to keep Trump's finger off the button. So these are people who used to have the actual keys in those Minutemen or MX silos out in the Dakotas. They had the keys needed to fire on the president's order. They've signed an open letter saying that the Republican candidate should not be entrusted with the nation's nuclear codes. This was issued on Thursday. It says the decision to use nuclear weapons requires composure, judgment, restraint, and diplomatic skill. These are Air Force officers, and they say the Republican candidate doesn't have that. On the contrary, he has shown himself time and time again to be easily baited, quick to lash out, dismissive of expert consultants, ill-informed of the basics of military and international affairs, especially nuclear weapons. So they say the Republican candidate should not be commander-in-chief. He should not be entrusted with the nuclear launch codes. He should not have his finger on the button. Now, they don't say who they want. It's interesting. It's not political. There's nobody's saying they want Hillary. It is only the Republican nominee that they address. Now, we had Ryan in Wisconsin today at some kind of a rally with the college Republicans. Well, we have some interesting news from the college Republicans closer to town here. At Liberty University, the college Republicans have repudiated Trump. This is not a candidate now, right? This is not some politician. This is the organization on that campus, right? This is the Falwell University there, where Jerry Falwell Jr. has essentially been defending Trump in the past week because of the Access Hollywood 2005 remarks. So the college Republicans down in Liberty University say, we want nothing to do with him, and they rebuke Falwell. They say, this is something that Christians ought to oppose, and they're very unhappy with Falwell. Remember, Falwell Sr. was the moral majority starting late 70s, 80s with Reagan, but now we have the next generation, and there's even an article about this. Dana Milbank yesterday in the Post The late Jerry Falwell created the moral majority and founded Liberty University. He built the religious right into a major political force. His son, Jerry Falwell Jr., is well on his way to destroying it. So we have the Access Hollywood tapes. Everybody knows them. Falwell is continuing to support Trump. He notes that we are all sinners. I guess we'll have to give him that, but it doesn't follow. Ralph Reed, Republican operative, is essentially belittling the importance of a 10-year-old tape, 11-year-old tape. Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council says he continues to support the Republican nominee. Pat Robertson of the Christian Broadcasting Network, this is the older generation, is saying, yeah, it doesn't mean anything. He's just trying to look like he's macho. Now, this is trivializing things that are actually, well, if proven, they're crimes. Sean Hannity. Well, Sean Hannity is notorious, but he's been fighting with Megyn Kelly. Sean Hannity's line is, King David, after all, had 500 concubines, for crying out loud. King David had 500 concubines, for crying out loud. Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham, who was a consistent chaplain to whoever was in power. Trump has crude comments, but the Democrats have a godless agenda, he says. Now, there are a couple of people who saved themselves. Russell Moore of the Southern Baptist Convention, Andy Crouch, and Wayne Grudem. I think we criticized Wayne Grudem here, theologian, right, Calvinist theologian, for he was favorable to Trump before, but now he says, I cannot commend the character of the Republican nominee, and I strongly urge him to withdraw from the election. James McDonald, on a part of the Republican Candidates Advisory Council, says this is misogynistic trash, and it comes from a lecherous outlook. So you look at all of them, right? Reed, Robertson, Falwell. I think they're putting political criteria above the obvious. Based on all this, notice a lot of this stuff is in Virginia, right? Falwell's in Virginia. Robertson is, I think, in Virginia Beach. So, according to the Washington Post, once again, the stars are aligning for Clinton in Virginia, and be nice to bring you the real clear thing if the computer would cooperate. But you get the idea. Virginia was supposed to be a battleground state, and now it seems to be becoming a Democratic state, a blue state. And one of the things we've been hearing insistently over the last couple of days is that the Trump forces are pulling out of Virginia. They're conceding that they can't win Virginia, so they're going to take their advertising budgets and television time and offices, volunteers, and computer stuff for data. They're going to take that all elsewhere, but not in the state of Virginia. So that is already a big turning point. I think we're talking about 13 electoral votes here in the state. So that, I think, sums up at least a good part of the world picture and the domestic picture here on October 14th, 2016. And remember, keep up with everything day by day by becoming a part of The American System, theamericans.tv. And we will see you next week, God willing.